Good evening, everyone. It's Ray here again from My, and I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming this evening Dr. Gemma Newman. Hello, Gemma.
Hello.
Gemma is someone that her work has interested me for some time, and I'm just going to cut straight to it and read a little bit about Gemma and to give you a better bit of insight who she is and the type of work that this wonderful doctor does. So Dr. Gemma Newman has worked in medicine for 15 years and is a senior partner at the family medical practice where she has worked for 11 years, studied at the University of Wales College of Medicine, and has worked in many specialties as a doctor, including elderly care, endocrinology, pediatrics, obstetrics, gynecology, psychiatry, general surgery, neurology, vascular surgery, rehabilitation medicine, and general practice. She gained additional qualifications in gynecology and family planning. She is a graduate of the AFMCP course and is a member of BSLM. Dr. Newman has a specialized interest in holistic health, plant-based nutrition, and lifestyle medicine. In her practice, she has come to understand that body, mind, and soul are not separate, and that it is only in addressing the root causes of stress and disconnection that we can truly heal from the inside out. Dr. Newman is an advisory board member of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, and has contributed content on the topic of diabetes for the Winchester University Plant-Based Nutrition course. She has also created content on the topic of mental health and nutrition for the Diploma of Culinary Medicine by the Medicinal Chef, and uses techniques she has learned to help her patients change their mindset to facilitate healing. She is also interested in the field of energetic healing and is a qualified Reiki practitioner. She gives holistic health, nutrition, and lifestyle advice to her patients, who has gained tremendous results using the power of their plate. She is regularly invited to teach other doctors and general public via training programs, podcasts, and conferences about the benefits of plant-based nutrition. Another passion of hers includes the promotion of no-till regenerative agriculture techniques in order to bring health back to our soil and our farming systems, so as to allow healing the ecosystem that sustains human life. Planetary health is intrinsically linked to human health, and she has spoken on the topic of other healthcare professionals at a debate at the Imperial College, as well as during the Extinction Rebellion events. As a broadcaster and writer, she has been featured on ITV, Channel 4, Channel 5, and Sky News Sunrise. She has contributed to articles for magazines including Glamour, Zest, and Health Magazine. She has spoken on many podcasts, including the Rich Roll podcast and the Deliciously Ella podcast, and is passionate about healing mind, body, and planet. That's impressive.
It's a long bio, actually. I'm surprised anyone's still listening.
Well, I hope they are.
Thank you for reading that.
Yeah, it's amazing. I suppose just to cut straight to it then, Dr. Newman, there's a couple of things that immediately that I'm drawn to from a doctor's perspective. It's very refreshing to hear a doctor talking about the holistic approach to health and getting to root causes. So I could maybe ask you to elaborate a little bit more around that, if you don't mind.
No, of course. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the human condition and why it is that we suffer, and what it is to suffer. And it's interesting. I don't think many doctors have quite the same interest, but for me, I've got a strong interest in religion and psychology. So thank you, Max. Can you go and lie down, please? I'll come in a minute. Sorry. So for me, it was an interesting kind of juxtaposition, because I studied religious studies when I was young, in my A level, and then I moved on to my medical degree. But I was always struck by how it was not just mechanisms of illness that that made someone well or ill. There was much more to it, and I realized fairly early on when I finished my medical degree and I was starting my medical practice that people didn't fit into the neat diagnostic boxes that we wanted to put them in. And people got well seemingly inexplicably, and people suffered even though, you know, we give them everything that we possibly could or that we knew of in medical science. So for me, there's always been a quest to understand more, studying psychology for that reason, especially having my patients since going into general practice. And I stumbled upon plant-based nutrition, really, because I had an understanding that nutrition must be important, but it was never really emphasized. Rather we were sort of taught about nutritional deficiencies and chronic diseases and pharmaceutical mechanisms of improving those diseases. And I began to realize that, you know, people who live healthy lives, they've got something very different that they've got going for them compared to people that don't. And why is that? And what do they do differently? And that was the beginning of my journey, really, into understanding the power of nutrition. And then, you know, my husband, as you mentioned previously, he discovered the power of plant-based nutrition when he was training for a marathon. He was able to stop getting recurrent injuries and inflammation, and he was able to improve his marathon running time by a whopping hour and 10 minutes. And I was just stunned by this. I thought, how can he know something that I don't? I'm supposed to be the one that knows about the human body. And so that was the impetus for all my studying from that point. And, you know, I had a basis of understanding. I'd tried to implement nutritional advice before, but I hadn't done enough of the studying. I hadn't really delved as deep as I wanted to. And so now it's wonderful for me because I can combine the nutritional approaches with psychological approaches, and also understanding that people are so much more even than they believe. You know, our minds are quite limited by what we believe ourselves to be and our upbringing and our experience. And sometimes it's quite hard for us to get out of the understanding that we are not our thoughts and we are not our emotions, but we've actually got a separate part of ourselves that can observe those things and reflect upon them, which I think is something that's really important to get to grips with. And I think it would help ease a lot of mental ill health if we could remember that simple truth as well. So I guess that's a long way of saying that it's been a long journey for me, but there's so much more to learn and I'm always learning.
Yeah, okay, great. I can remember listening to the Ritual podcast where I first came across yourself, and the podcast itself just blew me away. But when I picked up the when you were chatting about your husband reducing marathon time by over an hour, it was very hard to wrap your head around. But yeah. I said to myself, when I was able to recover from my the skin disease that I had through a plant-based diet, it really again was opened my mind and started to ask myself the questions of what else is possible, you know, here. And so that was a real interest of mine, and I suppose in one way or another way ultimately clicked into that podcast. So just even on that a little bit, would love to hear your perspective on mental health.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of nutrition, there's a definite link. There's been several studies now looking at that link. And the main ones that I can recall, there's the SMILES trial that was done back in 2017, which I think was quite revolutionary. It was a randomized control trial, and it wanted to understand whether diet could be used as a treatment for depression, because quite often there's an understanding that it might help to prevent it, or at least, you know, if you eat well, then you're less likely to sort of feel low, but nobody really analysed why. But this was a great study because they used essentially a modified Mediterranean diet intervention, and half the people ate a diet that was maximized in terms of their vegetables and whole grains and pulses and fruits, and a little bit of dairy, a little bit of fish to try and simulate the Mediterranean diet. And then the other half had social support, and they wanted to monitor their progress over time. And what was amazing in that study was that there was at least a third of the patients in the intervention group actually went into remission from their depression, compared to only 8% of those who were offered social support. So that was a real clue as to the power of nutrition. And there was another study that I can think of now that was done in the US, and that was another randomized controlled trial, but this time they used a wholly plant-based diet. And they had, they actually used a workplace environment. They used an insurance company, and they managed to get lots of employees over 10 different cities. I think there were, to my recollection, there are probably about 300 participants. And they just gave them some basic nutrition advice, and they offered them the option of ordering a plant-based meal at the workplace cafeteria. That was all that they did. That was the only intervention. So people didn't have to choose that meal, but there was an option, a healthy plant-based meal option for them to choose at lunchtime. But because of that sense of community that they built up in the workplace and the education session that they'd received, they had tremendous results. People chose the plant-based option, and people started to lose weight. They started to feel good. And what was interesting to me was not only did people's physical parameters of health get better, things like diabetes and heart disease and weight loss, but actually the psychological effects were far more interesting to me. So there was increased workplace productivity and reduced rates of anxiety and low mood. So for me, that was a really interesting clue as to the power of nutrition, and it's quite difficult to do nutrition studies that are intervention studies, and especially randomized controlled trials. So that's why these are particularly unique. But there are some precedents as to why that would be. You know, we're beginning to understand over the last 5-10 years of research that the microbiome is really the new frontier of medicine. You know, we thought it was the genetic code in the 90s, and then it was all about the hormones, and now all the scientists are raving about the microbiome, because we're starting to discover that many root causes of disease actually stem from having an imbalance in our microbes, in our gut and on our skin and so on. And that's what's really interesting to me at this stage, is the understanding that our mental health can actually be really impacted by the different kinds of bacteria that we're growing in our gut. And as you alluded to before, the feel-good neurotransmitters, serotonin and dopamine, can be regulated in some ways by the bacteria that live inside our gut. Now, it's somewhat misleading to say that the serotonin that's produced in our gut can go directly to our brain. Even though 80-90% of the serotonin in our body is produced in the gut, it doesn't actually cross the blood-brain barrier. However, what's interesting is that tryptophan, the amino acid that's responsible for helping our bodies to create that serotonin, does pass the blood-brain barrier. And what's fascinating is that there's some research to suggest that if you're having plant-based sources of tryptophan, it's actually more bioavailable to you than the animal-based sources, because instinctively, if you're thinking, well, where do I get this amino acid? People would look to foods that are high in tryptophan, such as chicken, for example. But the studies don't actually show that tryptophan is able to gain access to the brain. And it's thought to be because there's a lot more competition for other amino acids to pass the blood-brain barrier. Whereas if you have a plant-based source of protein with a high tryptophan content, such as pumpkin seeds, sesame seeds, butternut squash, for example, then these foods can allow the tryptophan access to the brain because of the fiber that the protein is attached to, and there's less competition for those amino acids to get inside the brain. So that's an interesting link there between optimizing mental health and using a plant-based diet to do that. So yeah, I mean, that's just one example, but if we think about what's included in a plant-based diet, we've got the fiber. Fiber is crucial for feeding our beneficial gut bugs. Fiber is actually a prebiotic. You probably hear people talk about probiotics, and people know the idea of a probiotic. They might see probiotic yogurt drinks in the supermarket, for example, or they might go to a health food shop and get some probiotics. But probiotics can be quite patchy in how they help us, because really they might be useful in the short term, especially if you have a course of antibiotics, because then what you're doing is you're killing off a load of beneficial microbes in the gut, as well as the ones that are causing your symptoms or your pathogen, such as a chest infection. But what we're starting to notice with probiotics is that they tend to just go straight through you. So they're a bit like the cavalry. They come along, they exert an effect for a short time period, and then they pass on through, and you've not really gained any long-term benefit from that. So how do you gain a long-term benefit to your gut microbiome? Well, the answer is through what you're eating, because the fiber or the prebiotic is what you feed those beneficial gut bugs with. And so that's going to be a really important component of a diet that helps you with your mental health. But what else is there? Well, we know that antioxidants and phytonutrients are really crucial for mental health as well. There are some studies to show that increased folate from vegetables and fruit has a really positive impact on mental health. And it's not the same when you take a folate supplement. It has to come from those fresh fruit and vegetables. And there are so many phytonutrients that we haven't even named yet. And they all act in synergy with each other, as well as with our microbes, to have that beneficial impact. So although it seems quite complicated, what it really boils down to is making sure that we've got loads of fruits and vegetables, whole grains and beans, and that we optimize our diet in that sense by having loads of fiber, loads of phytonutrients, loads of antioxidants, and all those polyphenols that are just going to be great, not only for our physical health, but our mental health as well.
Great. There's a lot, you covered a lot there. I would like to for some of our listeners, this may be the first time they've even never heard of, well, a few things there maybe. What is a whole food plant-based diet? So I just want to put that to you. In your view, what is a whole, to keep things simple for people, what is a whole food plant-based diet?
It's basically aiming to have fruits, vegetables, whole grains and legumes in your diet. And you can add in nuts and seeds and herbs and spices. And any combination of those 4 food groups is going to provide you with a tremendous amount of nutrients and exciting recipes to try. And that's essentially it. So if you imagine like a power plate, and you've got half of that plate filled with fruits and vegetables of all the colors of the rainbow, and then you've got about a quarter of that plate with whole grains. And if you suffer from celiac disease, or you've got non-celiac gluten sensitivity, you can choose things like brown rice or quinoa or buckwheat noodles or amaranth, or any other number of millet, for example. There's quite a lot of different grains that don't contain gluten, but we can talk a bit more about the origins of gluten sensitivity if you want to in a moment. Yeah. And legumes. So we're thinking about all the different kinds of beans you can imagine: green beans, chickpeas, lentils. You've got oats as well. So those are the main food groups. And it's important, if you're having a whole foods plant-based diet exclusively, that you also take a B12 supplement as well, because B12 is the only vitamin that you can't get through plant-based sources, because it's made by microbes in the soil. So in previous times, we may have exposed ourselves to microbes in the soil or water, but at the moment we're not doing that for obvious reasons. We don't want to eat soil particularly, and we don't want unclean water. So it's natural that we wouldn't have those same things. So if you have, say for example, you eat a cow, if the cow's been grass-fed and pasture-raised, it's going to be munching on grass with microbes in it and on it, which would allow that cow to have B12 vitamin. But if your cow has not been grass-fed or pasture-raised, then it goes into a factory farm, and then its feed is mostly grain, and it actually has a B12 supplement in that grain. So really, for the vast majority of the meat that we eat, which does come from factory farms, unless you know exactly where this animal has been reared, you can guarantee it's come from a factory farm, then you can't say that it doesn't contain things like antibiotics, which will have a negative impact on your microbiome, but also any vitamin B12 that it contains will have come from a supplement. So in a sense, you're just cutting out the middle cow by taking a B12 supplement yourself. So that's basically it, trying to keep it the most simple version of it that you can. And you can make a variety of amazing foods with those simple ingredients. So you can make things like porridge or plant-based pancakes, or you can have like a low sugar granola, muesli, plant milks. You can have a fry up without the oil. You could have the mushrooms and the tomato. You can make scrambled tofu instead of scrambled egg. You can have a plant-based sausage. There's loads of different options, and that's just breakfast. Simple swaps. So for example, if you really like a spaghetti bolognese, you can make a one-pot lentil bolognese. If you really like a chicken curry, you can have a chickpea curry, for example. Lunchtime, you can have a burrito with black beans and guacamole and rice and salsa. So you can see that actually those simple ingredients that I've just mentioned actually can give you a huge array of different kinds of foods. And it's an exciting opportunity to get creative and imagine your favorite recipes, but recreated in different ways.
Okay, great. I suppose we could even take it a step back a little bit, and I had wrote down to ask you, maybe people would, like, for myself, there was a lady that approached me one day in a restaurant that I was in, and she heard that I had a skin issue, and that I had come through it, and a mutual friend had told this lady about that. And for this lady then had psoriasis, but it was more of an annoyance for her. It wasn't like really aggressive. And she had said to me, look, I heard that you had overcome this real bad skin issue. What did you do? And I basically told her that for 7 or 8 months I just ate basically raw vegetables. I did loads of juicing and that sort of stuff. And she was like, her response was, jeepers, that's a bit extreme. But for me, where I was at, and during that time, about the 2-year period, I would have been in bed approximately between 25 to 30% of that. And excuse me, because the boils, hives of the skin were that aggressive that I needed to lie still on bed. And if I moved anyway, it literally would have brought me to tears because pain was so bad. So for me personally, the pain drove me. Would have tried anything at that point. Where in that scenario for the lady, as I explained to her, her illness is a little bit of an annoyance for her. Me, I didn't feel I had any option. So in one way, for me, I was backed into a corner, and it was easier to make that choice where I was desperate. So for people that are maybe going through similar scenarios, likes of myself, where did you feel that it was the right place, to possibly suggest this to some of your clients? At what point in over the last few years do you feel, okay, I'll maybe suggest this to this lady or that man, and see how they take it up?
So whenever I'm in a consultation with a patient, I mean, the current situation notwithstanding, things are very challenging at the moment, but I will almost always aim to include some form of nutritional advice if they are open to it and if they are responsive to it. So it really depends. I mean, everybody's got their own motivations. For some people, they're ready for drastic change and they're seeking it out. So it would just be a gentle nudge or a simple resource, and they've gone off and changed their lives for 360, turnaround, or 180, I should say. Anyway. Whereas for other people, even with the most severe conditions, it takes a lot of time to talk through the options and consider how they might benefit. So it really varies depending on the person. But I would say that if somebody has heart disease or diabetes or arthritis or kidney disease or an autoimmune disease, then they may be more motivated to try a simple whole foods plant-based diet. They may find that getting their head around a raw diet for several months is more than they can imagine at that time. But yeah, many people I've had the pleasure to treat have found that simple basic interventions and simple swaps have made huge changes. So I've had patients that have dramatically brought down their blood pressure, improved their kidney disease, improved their inflammatory bowel conditions, reverse their low-grade prostate cancer, minimize their diabetic complications, all through the power of what they put on the end of their fork. But as I say, everybody's different. And some people, even with the most severe disease, may take some persuasion, whereas others who are really fit and healthy and just looking for that extra edge are really super motivated. So it really depends.
Yeah, okay. And I've found that myself. And I suppose it just really um, it's where you're at within your own journey. And I suppose myself over the years, as I have navigated these nutritional waters, I suppose I have started, slowly but surely introducing new things, and once I feel the results physically myself and mentally, it interests me to explore more. But I say, thankfully, I was backed into a corner at that point, and although it was a very tough time, it resulted in giving me much
Sounds
more.
awful. It sounds
Yeah,
like there was a lot of struggle for you at that time in your life.
yeah, it was, and especially for my wife as well. Thankfully, at that time, we didn't have any children, but we got through it together. Having that support was massive. She was just a complete rock for me at that time, and still is today. There's a couple of things that one subject that really interests me is the subject of, and you tapped on it slightly there, microbiome, and even talking about the gut bugs. I'm sure some of our listeners may have only heard that for the first time, thinking, "What? There's bugs in my gut." Um, but I have really, I suppose, got into I was going to say get into the understanding of the microbiome. I do not any means say that I understand the microbiome, but it's a real interesting area that I'm trying to explore and learn more about, and how as you say, the microbiome itself is so linked to our health, and how the connection with the outside world actually influences the microbiome, and our connection or separation from nature has an effect on the microbiome. And so could you elaborate a little bit more on that, please, Gemma?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've got bugs that live inside our gut, and they can be viral, they can be bacterial, they can be parasitic, they can be fungal, and they live in harmony with us, and they change with every meal that we eat. So there's some colonies that stick around for many years, and there are other colonies that change depending on what we've put in our mouth in the last time that we ate. And it's an ecosystem, and it's forever changing and evolving, and it's like the microcosm of of within us is a little bit like the universe without us, if you like. So there's billions of them, many different types, and if you took the entire gastrointestinal tract and lay it out, it would take up about 2 tennis courts worth of space, and that's all of the space on which these little bugs can thrive and grow. So in essence, if you think about it, they're actually technically outside of our body because they're outwardly facing, because the tube between the mouth and the bottom, that's technically considered to be the outside world because it's a barrier. There's a barrier between our insides and the outside. But there are links between what the gut bugs do and what the rest of our body is doing. So there are special tight junctions in the gut that control what goes in and out through the gut, and all the nutrients and the foods that we eat have to go through these junctions in order to nourish us. And what's interesting to me is that about 80% of our immune cells also reside just inside that gut layer. It's called the GALT, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And that is what can flare up to seemingly normal stimuli. So for you and your hives, you may have been reacting to things that you probably previously wouldn't have reacted to had you had completely normal gut health at that time. And so what we need to have in our gut is not only beneficial gut bugs, but we also need a really decent gut barrier in order to protect us not only from outside pathogens and toxins, but also to protect us from our own immune system, which can go awry and start to react to things, certain proteins that it wouldn't have reacted to before had that gut lining been intact. So say, for example, if I give you an example of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, that didn't used to be a problem sort of 20, 30 years ago. It's becoming a serious problem now. And that's partly because of the way that we refine grains. So they used to be stone ground and now they're steel ground. But it's also in part due to the fact that we use quite a lot of pesticides in our agriculture. and they're known to be antibiotic. They're actually known to kill bugs. That's why they're so good at what they do. They protect the crops from the bugs in the air, but they also kill off bugs potentially in our own bodies. And so that can start to break down that integral gut lining and make us more reactive to those gluten proteins within that bread that you would have previously not reacted to because of your immune system and its sensitivity to those things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I find that very interesting. Definitely. And I think just to would like to just wrap up this first segment, and in the second segment, I would like to discuss. You tapped very quickly on vitamin B12. Now, the vitamin industry and the vitamin market is so, it can be so overwhelming as well. Even when you say vitamin B12, I know that there's there's a few different types, and there's specific types that you should take, some types that aren't as beneficial for you. But I would just like to touch on vitamins that you think would be beneficial, specifically now to help boost our immune system through during these real unsteady and unsure times. And I would also like to hear your thoughts on soil health in segment 2, if that's okay.